I was in a bookstore, in a gift shop, and running around, active, young boy, full of energy. I came across a Confederate patrol cap. You know, there were two of them. There was one for the Union. It was blue, it had the American flag on. There was one that was gray for the Confederacy. It had the stars and bars that I had never really seen. I'm like, okay, that's kind of cool. So I grabbed it, I put it on my, ride a toy horse around the gift store. And my mom catches me on the side of her. She's like, what in the hell? Psh, snatched the hat off, gave me a book, set me down. She didn't yell at me or anything like that. But her actions were so stern, I knew I had done something seriously wrong. And when we got back home, I asked her, I said, Mama, why did you take the hat off my head? And she said, well, Troy, that hat is representative of people who fought to keep black people enslaved. Black people enslaved? You know, my only reference to slavery at that age was the film Moses. If you've ever seen this old Charlton Heston film about how Moses freed the Jewish people from bondage in Egypt, and I was like, wow, we were slaves? Well, nobody told me about that. I felt ignorant, I felt ashamed. But it was the awakening moment. It was the first time that I realized my skin color may be different in the eyes of other people. And so I want to pose a question to you. Have you ever had an awakening moment? Thank you, everyone. I'm delighted that you could join us today at St. Cofer Books. It's a beautiful day outside, so I appreciate the sacrifice that you all made to participate in this discussion. And I was just talking to this lovely group of young ladies right here from Colorado about what compelled me to write Unwritten Truce. And really, this is my reality, it's my truth, and how I experienced the world as a young man. July 26, 1948, Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, which was a seminal milestone in the history of our nation that will always be a pivotal point in time. What many people don't know is that the impetus that caused him to desegregate the armed forces, that's what that executive order did, was atrocities being committed against black veterans following the conclusion of World War II. We'll talk about some of those things and how President Truman responded to that. But it wasn't just Harry Truman. There were a lot of brilliant men and women that were pushing for change. Dr. Howard Hastie, the second dean of Howard Howard Law School, was pivotal and a part of the presidential committee that Truman appointed to effect real and meaningful change. And this was the first time that the United States as a government pushed back against segregation, which was the law of the land at that time. And I say that was the cornerstone of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, was this executive order. He did more than just the executive order for the military. He also did another executive order, 9980, that opened the federal government employment up to men and women of color. And a lot of people may have seen the movie Hidden Figures. So that legislation made it possible for the women in the American Computing Service to get that job working in the space program in the 1960s, and that was started in 1948. So what I'm showing right here is a picture of my father in the middle, young man. He's about 6 years old. He's there with his brothers and sisters. He grew up in Monticello, Florida. He was a sharecropper. That's like one step removed from slavery. They were free to go and come, but their income was tied to how many crops they could raise and what they could sell, and in exchange for it, the landowner would give them land to live in and to work, and it was a significant form of oppression. But that's how many millions of people of color made their way in the early 40s. But the thing that is significant is my grandmother, who had a 7th grade education, insisted that her kids learn and take advantage of opportunities through education. And of her 9 kids, 7 of them have college degrees. One's a dentist, one is a pharmacist, one has a PhD in education, an accountant. My father joined the military and served for 20 years before getting out and working for AT&T. So the struggle is real. Every underrepresented segment of the American community has had to contend with the notion that black and brown people, people of a different sexual orientation, the gay and lesbian community, don't belong and don't deserve a seat at the table. Black Americans surmised very early on that one of the strongest arguments they could articulate for full inclusion into American society was to serve their nation in uniform. And black Americans did so by the millions in every war or conflict the United States has ever served in since this country's founding. This man pictured right here is Crispus Attucks, a mulatto man of black and Indian descent, was the first American killed in the American Revolution. We see the role that women played in affecting change in the United States. Women have served, going back to the tales of Molly Pitcher, who provided water to cool down cannons at the Battle of Concord, and took over when her husband fell wounded to continue to provide ammunition for the cannons that were involved in the Battle of Concord. 33,000 women served in World War I. The armistice in 1917 ended, and those women pushed for women's suffrage and the right for women to vote. And that amendment was passed in 1919, and it was because of the service that changed people's minds about the role of women in American society. This picture here is General Baron von Steuben. He was the first Inspector General of the United States Army and the Continental Army of the 1770s. He was a Prussian officer. At the time, Prussia had the finest, most well-trained military in the world. What a lot of folks don't know is that he was gay, and he was fleeing persecution and a scandal that involved him where it came out that he was a gay man. When he came to the United States, we didn't care about his sexual orientation because we had a bigger, more common goal that we were seeking, which was political freedom from the United Kingdom. And a lot of times that's the way it works for minorities. When the shit hits the fan, opportunities open up and people are willing to overlook the insignificant prejudices that hold us back. And I say an example is with President Barack Obama. If not for the economic crisis of 2007, 2008, would people have voted for him who didn't look like him in significant enough numbers for him to become president? I pose that as a question. I certainly think it did have an effect on some people looking beyond color. So, Unwritten Truce, what is this really about? How did I come to this title? Well, it stems back to the American Civil War. The Civil War effectively ended slavery in the United States. It established the slaves and their descendants as American citizens, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, those that we call the Civil War Amendments. But the underlying cause of the Civil War was a belief in racial or white supremacy. That was never addressed. The Civil War ended with an armistice. The Southerners were losing. They were tired of dying, and they said, okay, we're going to stop fighting. We're going to put our guns down. But the deep underlying cause, that belief in racial supremacy that is codified in the statements of secession, the declarations of secession, South Carolina, Virginia, Texas, Alabama signed these, all stating that the natural order was the subordination of the black race to the white race. And so that belief system was never challenged. And so that is the undergirding thing that propels inequity and racism today. The Compromise of 1876, in which Rutherford B. Hayes agreed to remove the troops that were in the Deep South during Reconstruction in exchange for the electoral college votes of Louisiana, Florida, and Alabama, made him president. And it was an unwritten decree between him and the congressmen of those southern states that he would withdraw the troops in exchange for their electoral college votes. And that is the unwritten truce. So with the withdrawal of the American troops, the KKK became prominent. The laws that essentially made the former slaves slaves by another name came into place. And the ripple effects of that unwritten truce are still being felt by us today. I'm gonna, I had a clip of Dr. King who describes it so eloquently. I will pose this to you to do, in your own time, but there's an NBC interview of Dr. Martin King 11 months before he was assassinated, and he talks about what was it about the black experience that made our assimilation into America so much different from Italian immigrants, from German immigrants, from the Polish immigrants. And he does a brilliant job in about 2 minutes of laying that out, how our color was made a stigma so that we couldn't assimilate no matter how smart you were, no matter how much of a subject matter expert you were, your color would prevent you from achieving to the limits of your ability. So that's kind of that unwritten truce and that was the thing. So we go to fast forward to 1947. A lot of you have probably seen this picture. There's a picture of Harry Truman holding up a newspaper that says Dewey wins. And Dewey was his opponent in the presidential race of 1948. And the reason everybody thought Dewey was going to win was because Truman signed this controversial executive order basically integrating the armed services. And it was at a time where if you weren't black, integration was a non-issue in 1948. It was very unpopular. It was so unpopular, in fact, that all of the Southern delegates walked out of the Democratic National Convention when he made his speech, and he said that he was intended upon desegregating the armed services. So after all of the Southern delegates walked out of the convention, about 3 months prior to the election, they formed another party called the Dixiecrats. And they nominated Strom Thurmond, the former governor of South Carolina, as the presidential nominee. And so when election day came about and Truman won, everybody was so surprised because they thought he was going to lose because of this executive order. So the impetus for change. This is what was going on in 1946. The blinding of Sergeant Isaac Woodward. Sergeant Woodward was a young man from Brooklyn, New York, who fought in World War II. He came back home at the end of the war. He was on a bus going back to Brooklyn, and he had a confrontation with a racist bus driver. He wanted to stop to use the bathroom. The bus driver said, "Boy, get your ass back in the seat." The sheriff, his name was Shull, beat the young Sergeant Bullard until he was unconscious, threw him in jail, and gouged his eyes out with a billy club. Left him in the cell, and when Truman found out about this, he was livid. He directed the Department of Justice to launch a full investigation into the atrocity. He wanted someone held accountable, and he felt as the chief executive of the United States, if he couldn't protect the men who fought for democracy in a war against a racist enemy, that he had failed. So he brought the sheriff to trial, which was unheard of in 1948. A white man, especially a police officer, standing trial for beating a black man was simply unheard of. He was acquitted within about 30 minutes, and so that incident was one of a few that launched Truman into studying the problem of racism. Now, I don't want you to get it twisted. Harry Truman was not about social equality. He used the N-word promiscuously, as did a lot of people of that time. I tend to be very pragmatic in my approach. If somebody's offered me a hand up, I'm not going to judge the hand, right? I'm gonna get myself from the situation that's holding me down, and then we can have another conversation, right? So Truman was not about social equality, but what he was about is he knew that black people in America were not getting a fair shake. He knew that equal protection under the law was a fallacy. It was not a reality. He appointed a presidential commission to study the problem of equal treatment under the law, the President's Commission on Race, and they came back with about 10 findings. He implemented many of those findings, one of which that he did not implement was a presidential ban against police brutality. And here it is today, 70 years later, we still struggle with black men unarmed being killed at the hands of police, and the police doing it with impunity, not being held accountable. And I understand police have a very difficult and tough job to do, but if we are to be true to the letter of the Constitution, it is that all men and women are created equal and therefore should be treated equally, and no one is above the law. So we have some work to do on that accord, but that was the background that compelled Truman to move forward. How many folks out here have heard of the show called Mythbusters? Okay, it's a pretty cool little show. We're going to do a little bit of myth busting of our own today. So a lot of times you will hear the Republican Party say that they are the party of Lincoln, that they are the party that advanced civil rights. Technically true, but really not true. And what I have here is a slide that shows how each of the senators and congressmen voted for the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And what you can see is it wasn't about party affiliation that determined the vote. It was about what part of the country you were elected to represent. So if you look at Democrats from the states that made up the Union during the Civil War, 95% of the members of the House that were from former Union states voted yes. If you look at the Senate, on the Democratic side of the equation, 98% of the senators from former Union states voted yes. If you look at Republicans, 85% of the congressmen from former Union states who were Republicans voted yes. So we got in the House, 95% of Democrats in the North voted yes, 85% of Democrats from the North voted yes. When we look at the Senate, we have 98% of the Democrats voting yes in the Democratic Party, and 84% of the Democrats from the North voting yes. So you can see the numbers are more in favor for the Democrats from the North. Now, if we look at the former Confederate states, 91% of the congressmen from the former Confederate states voted no. 95% of the senators from the former Confederate states voted no. This was in July 2nd, 1964. By the time the presidential election rolled around in November, these Democratic Southerners had switched parties to become Republicans. So they voted for the Republican presidential nominee only 6 months after being Democrats and voting in opposition to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So this one bill, the bill to bring about equality, caused them to flip parties, and they became Republicans. And the southern states have voted largely Republican since 1964. So fast forward to November 2008, if we look back at the presidential election with Barack Obama, you can see all the states in blue that voted for Barack Obama, the ones in red that voted no. They mirror exactly the Civil War map, with blue being the North and red states being gray Confederate states, with the exception of 6 states. And interestingly enough, the 3 states that voted red were border states that fought for the North in the Civil War, but voted Republican in the 2008 presidential campaign. The 3 states from the South that flipped the blue were Florida, North Carolina, and Virginia, and those were the southern states. So a lot of those regional differences still exist, and a lot of the separation is regarding race. But going back to the military, since the military integrated, they have grown to advocate and push for inclusion and equality. And we see that with what's going on with women in the military. President Barack Obama opened all MOSs to women in 2014. There used to be a combat exclusion that said women could not serve on the front lines in combat, could not fly fighter planes, could not do all these things, and he ended that policy. So women make up 15% of the total armed forces, but at the very top ranks, what we would call a CEO or a general, women make up 5%. When we compare that to what's going on with our Fortune 500 companies, women make up 51% of the workforce, but still only 5% of the top positions in business are represented by women. And that is because of a lot of the discriminatory factors that are still in play. This outstanding looking soldier and officer in the middle is Nadia West. She is the first black Surgeon General of the United States Army. She is the first woman physician to be elected as a Surgeon General of the Army. She is a DC native, grew up as an orphan, a 1982 graduate of West Point. The outstanding officer on the bottom is Michelle Howard. She is the Navy's first ever 4-star admiral, and she is going on to do big and great things. And these firsts are important because they tell our young people to strive for anything. Don't let anyone hold you back or discourage you. You can, if you will, if you put your heart and mind into it and your energy behind it. Similarly, with LGBTQ equality, the armed forces has grown to push for equality. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was implemented in 1993 and basically said, if you don't disclose your sexual orientation, then the military leadership can't ask you about that. That's, off the table. Prior to Don't Ask, Don't Tell, if it was discovered that you were gay or lesbian, those were grounds to end your career. You could be expelled from the military simply for your sexual orientation. And what a lot of folks forget is that President Clinton was voted into office to end that policy so that gays and lesbians could serve openly. But he fell short because of a political pushback, and Don't Ask, Don't Tell was the compromise that they came up with. As awkward as that seems and sounds, it was an advancement for the LGBTQ community. Fast forward to 2009, where we had a number of years for people to get more comfortable with gays serving in the military. President Barack Obama said, you know what, this policy is stupid. I'm going to remove it to allow everyone to serve openly regardless of your sexual orientation. And so the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell happened in 2009. The Marriage Equality Act began to spread throughout the country about the same time as people were beginning to bring down these artificial barriers to inclusion for the LGBTQ community. And then the last thing that President Obama did is he lifted the transgender ban in 2016. And I call it a silent, significant portion of the population wasn't cool with that. They didn't protest or say anything about it. They just kind of went underground. So during the presidential election between Hillary Rodham Clinton and Donald Trump, America was introduced to the phrase, "Make America Great Again." I thought we were all always great, but if you say, "Make it great again," that implies that we lost some greatness along the way. And it begs the question, when was this time where America was great? Was it before lesbians and gays were allowed to serve openly in the military? Was it before walking the front door of a business without being discriminated against? This Make America Great Again campaign was a dog whistle to the people who believed that America had become too liberal, a politically correct way of saying, I'm not really comfortable with the degree of inclusion that has been transpiring in our country over the past several decades. Make America Great Again was a pushback against inclusion, in my opinion, and I talk about this in the book, and I make the argument for that. One of the first things that President Donald Trump did when he came into office is he instituted a ban on transgender members of the American community who can no longer join the military except under certain restrictions. That being, they don't require the sexual reassignment surgery, that they don't have the diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So that's one of the reasons why his base is so fervently in support of him. He's doing the dirty work for them. Their biases and the prejudices that many Americans still hold, that they've never dealt with earnestly, are still there, and they found a champion that will voice their own biases without them having to do it themselves. Another great interview that speaks to the modern day challenges to inclusion is a 2-minute video of Coach Muffet McGraw. She's the Notre Dame women's head basketball coach, and she talks about a reporter asking her why she only had women assistant coaches. And she basically said, hey, women make up 49 to 51% of society. They have less than 5% of the basketball coaching jobs. If I don't hire them, who will? How are these women going to get an opportunity to do what they love and pursue that game that they grew up playing and loving and enjoying? So Muffet McGraw says, when children are born, the script is already set about gender roles, and men have the power. And as society, we need to take a collective look at that and say, is this the world we want to leave to our kids? Is this the world that we want to live ourselves? There is a gap between what we profess in our founding principles and the reality in what we live day to day. So today's challenges are much more complex than just simple race. They include socioeconomic status, gender, sexual orientation, xenophobia. But the connective tissue that bonds all forms of discrimination is intolerance. Intolerance for that which is different, and that is a function of ignorance. It is no longer enough for us to call out the inequity and injustice when we see them. We know that as a community of people, we have always advanced changes in policy and real changes in our lives by exercising our right to vote. The Black Americans in the 60s marched because half of them who lived in the South couldn't vote. That was the only avenue of expression that was available to them, and it was through the marching that we got the right to vote. Now that we have the right to vote, and things aren't as bad as they were in the 40s and the 60s, I think as a community, Black Americans have kind of stepped back a little bit, kind of kicked back a little bit, and the gains that were made by our grandparents and great-grandparents are being systematically walked back. And it is going to be through the ballot box that we assert the founding principles of this nation. We still have 10 military bases named after Confederate leaders. Men who betrayed their oath to this nation and took up arms to oppress an entire race of people. And in 2019, we still bear their name on the front gate of a taxpayer-funded military base. Not only is that out of step with our values and our laws, it's out of step with the military's own values. And I've started a petition with an organization called Citizens Against the Spread of Hatred. And I'm asking everyone to go to change.org, look for the petition that speaks to renaming the military bases that are named after Confederate leaders. That is one significant way we can affect change. Because as long as we have any air of legitimacy, those who believe in racial supremacy will clutch on to that. They will hang on to that as a reason to continue their belief system. You cannot be good people on both sides. This is an issue that is a moral issue, and we know that we fought a war over this moral issue that should have settled it all, but there are still things that need to be addressed. And so that's my pitch. So I thank everybody for your time. You can get a copy of the book, Unwritten Truce, the Armed Forces and American Social Justice. I encourage everybody to get out and vote. Voting changes things. People who are registered to vote sit on juries. Right? All right, peace and love. Thank you.